Mr. Ganesh Rao will be sharing the experience, his knowledge with all of you. He is working in a shipment company for more than around 15 years and expert in enterprise pillar. He is from Mumbai and he will be taking the class. I can say that I am 100% confirmed that he will be saying those examples, those things which you have never heard. It's a different type of experience you will be getting from Mr. Ganesh Rao. So I am giving the right to Mr. Ganesh Rao. He will be communicating in the entire class with all of you. I am also there. If you all find any problem, we will take care of. Don't worry. But for a few seconds, any internet issue, don't take any tension. We will take care of everything. Okay? And it will be helpful for everybody who have joined the class. This entire session is automatically recorded and you will be able to view the recording in YouTube also either Monday or Tuesday. Today is one session and tomorrow is another session. Both you should all be doing. It will help you to have a knowledge about enterprise pillar, which is there in every syllabus, whether it's CIMA US, whether it's CIMA, whether it's ACCA, everywhere. Okay, so now I am giving the right to Mr. Ganesh Rao.
Good afternoon. Hello, am I audible?
100%.
Wonderful. So should we start? Should we wait for a few minutes for some more people to join?
No, we should start.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, students. I'm very happy to be here to basically take you through some experiences, some knowledge, some opportunity where we have had use the link between the academic side and the practical side. So as Mr. Prakash said, I would like to probably give you a quick introduction about myself. Before that, I would of course would like to know a little bit about you. So please use the chat box for responding to my questions, so it becomes easy for everyone to see and understand without any distraction to the momentum. So how many of you are currently pursuing CIMA? Just type in yes. Wonderful. Are you in the operational level or management level? Can you just put OP or MG? Wonderful. Wonderful. We have a mixed bag of people, so I am sure that the sessions would be interesting to everyone as we move forward. Am I audible to everyone? Can I start? Wonderful. So my name is Ganesh Rao. As Mr. Prakash mentioned, I have more than 21 years of corporate experience, having worked in multiple industries, primarily into finance and accounting and into operations management. I have worked in the Middle East, I have worked in manufacturing, I have worked in IT, ITES, and currently I am with the shipping industry. Over the last 21 years, I have been fortunate to work on multiple areas in finance, whether it is financial planning, financial analysis, financial accounting, reporting, variance analysis, and so many other areas across different organizations. One thing I see as I have been doing is the fact that there is a link between each of the responsibilities that you execute across different domains, and it gets strongly connected to academic side of what we do. What typically happens today is that while we are academically qualified, sometimes we find it difficult to relate to what we study to what we work. I think I also probably started my career in a phase where the country was undergoing a lot of changes in terms of both the economic side, the political side, the technology side, and so on. So from mid 90s to mid, I would say 2017, 2018, I'm sure you will understand the fact that the country has undergone a lot of changes. And all of us, probably people like us or people similar to me, have been fortunate to see the best of both sides. So I'll briefly talk about what I have done, how I believe that the academic side of what we are going through today would help based on the experiences I've had. We'll cover briefly an overview of the enterprise pillar. I'll talk about that a little bit as well in terms of how enterprise pillar is extremely important and relevant to studying either finance or accounting or taxation or statutory law or anything, because I would say it's the centerpiece of everything. So briefly, if I get started in terms of what I am currently doing. So basically, I manage a large team of people who are into financial operations for more than 20 legal entities around the world. We deliver payable services, receivable services. We do reconciliation of bank statements. We do general ledger accounting, which means trial balance, P&L accounting. We do balance sheet reconciliations, and ultimately we also do consolidation of entities as well as management reporting. This is basically a journey in terms of where we've all studied our accounting, from bookkeeping to transaction accounting to accounting in terms of running up the trial balance on a monthly, quarterly, and half-yearly basis, and then basically going to the next stage of P&L and fixed asset accounting, and of course the balance sheet and the consolidation. In terms of the enterprise pillar, the way I see that pillar today is it is a combination of how organizations are formed, structured, designed in order to deliver what a primary objective of an organization is. Because you come from operational management and strategic level, I don't think I need to take you through the fundamentals of organization. But having said that, just to probably bring the context, it's important for us to understand that organizations are nothing but primarily units, groups, teams, formations. It can be in public space, it can be in charitable space, it can be in education, healthcare, it can be for profit, it can be for profit for various reasons or various types. And as we look at organizations, the way they are formed and the way they are enabled to execute, because the way we are formed is also how effective the execution is. And that is why you see a lot of organizations initially when they start are probably small. They are in an era where changes are not so many, so they are able to execute in the way they are formed. But as they move forward, they also see that the way they are set up needs to be reorganized. So a lot of organizations go through restructuring, they go through realignments. They try and bring in an element of strategy to the way they are organized, because they believe that is the only way to survive in the market. There are a lot of consultants today around the world, and I'm sure you know those names as well, like the likes of McKinsey's and the KPMG's and the E&Y's and many other companies who are specialized in studying the organizations very carefully, seeing what is not working, where there are wastages, where there are overlaps, how these overlaps can cause inefficiency, how these overlaps can add more cost, or how these overlaps can actually take the company or the organization very far from the customer. Because the most important thing for a customer who buys any product or service is the ability to access the key people in the organization or the company, especially when he's in distress. And that is where fundamentally I believe a lot of these technology and related barriers, I would say, does not help the customer reach out to the company, or if he needs an additional service, or if he needs some maintenance and so on. Of course, the context differs from whether you are selling a product or a service, whether you're selling it to a customer who's a business or an individual. So whether it is B2B or B2C, whether it is whether you're selling it to a business who is in turn manufacturing something else, or is he only assembling or only adding value and finally selling it to the end customer. So we will not try and get into so much of detail on how that could happen, but fundamentally the very purpose of the organization is to ensure continuity, is to ensure certain policies and procedures, is to ensure certain guidelines for people to operate. Because what happens in organizations usually is, it is a combination of people like you and me. It is a combination of skills, it's a combination of knowledge, it's a combination of certain strengths and weaknesses each of us possess when we get into it. It doesn't matter whether you are a fresher, experienced, professionally qualified, if you are a highly technology qualified, or you are purely a marketing person or a salesperson. Ultimately, all of us bring something to the table. And what helps the organization is the combination or the complementing skills of all these people. Am I audible and clear so far? Am I losing anybody? Yes? Okay, I'm seeing yes, so I'm assuming that I can go on. Wonderful. So basically, I was trying to reinforce the fact that organizations are primarily set up to achieve certain goals and objectives. We'll probably go into the details of what these things mean, why are they different, what typically successfully what typically helps an organization to be successful and so on. But as I said, because we have multiple types of people, multiple skills and knowledge coming in, there is always a need to have some governance, some policies, some guidelines. See, policies and rules and regulations are the extreme side of how we look at it. But everything stems from what we call the guidelines or the ethics or the ethos. So we'll get into that a little bit, but it is very, very simple as a concept that there are purposes why organizations are formed. There are purposes why they are structured the way they are. There are purposes why they have a very clear objective or goal. There are purposes why they are formed either as a small or a medium company, whether they bring in, they come in as a partnership, or they come in as a listed company, or they come in as a family business. There are very successful family business around the world. There are very successful listed companies around the world. There are no one right way of saying that a company can only be successful if it is a listed company. There are a lot of examples. We'll go into that as we move across into the session. So this is, the reason I touched upon this most important element of organization is, this is the foundation of what we call an enterprise. An enterprise is basically an entity, a legal person, a legal entity, which is formed by a group of people coming together for a purpose, with a clear objective or a goal, with some vision in mind as to where they want to reach. And the reason why we have these goals and objectives is to be sure that we are progressing in the right direction in which we are supposed to go. Else it becomes very difficult and we do not know whether we are towards going towards our direction or not. And going back into my experience in terms of what I've seen and what I've done, it's also important for me to highlight the fact that technology has played a lot of significant role in the last, I would say, at least 15 years. While we talk about the era of internet in the mid-90s, the era of smartphone in the mid-2000s, to the era of Internet of Things or artificial intelligence and machine learning and so many different things that are happening today. Today, it is all about miniaturization, where everything is smaller, everything can do more than what we thought. If you possibly have gone through certain information on the internet, the size of a hard disk or a hard drive 40 years back was almost the size of a lorry, which is of 2 or 3 MB. Today you get almost 128 GB worth of a pen drive, which is less than the size of an index finger. So the reason I'm quoting this example is because it is all about how do we accommodate information today, and how do we see the difference in the last 30 or 40 years in terms of how data is processed, data is transmitted, how data is used, how data is becoming important in terms of conversion into information, and so on. And with the changes that we see around us, uh, I think our way of working, the definition of work. So work used to be something very different a few years back, not just in India, but even outside the country, where work used to be people coming together physically into an office, sitting and doing a lot of paperwork with very minimum intervention from technology at that point in time, which was a personal computer. I'm talking about 70s and 80s. From there, today we're talking about work, which is virtual. The very fact that we are conversing over an online medium today, where I possibly do not see people, but you can see me and you can still hear me, is an excellent example of how the world has evolved and how organizations have evolved to be in line with how the world is. So, hello, can you hear me? Okay, I just want to be sure that I'm not losing anybody, or you're not losing me. So, in the context of technology, in the context of organization, in the context of enterprise, where the primary focus is coming together as a group with skills and knowledge for a purpose, for achieving certain goals. So, I will, I'll be happy to basically take you through some concepts in a simple PowerPoint, where I think we will talk about a little bit of all these as we move on. The intention is not to go into detail. The intention is not to go into the the words, the sentences, but the intention is to get an essence of what we're trying to cover and why, as a pillar, enterprise pillar, it is important for us to understand the foundation part of what an enterprise is. There have been a lot of studies, there have been a lot of people who looked at organizations during those days and throughout, and then started defining how an organization can be formed, how it can be structured, what is ideal for what business, and so on. So we will go into it. So before that, I only want to know if you have any questions, you have any comments. Do you want me to probably cover, or do you have any thoughts on what I've said so far or what I've covered so far? Karthik, you said generalize. So you want me to generalize, or you think it is too general? Hello? Okay, so feel free to stop me. It is important for me to understand whether you are getting what I'm trying to convey. You have to stop me, because if you can't get what I'm saying, I think all of us are not putting our time for effective use today. Okay, so let me get straight away jump into the presentation. The presentation is only a guideline for us to stick to what we want to cover. Yeah, and wherever possible, I'll give you examples. Wherever possible, I will explain to you with definition and concepts of what we're trying to cover. And wherever we require, because it is only an introduction and a broad understanding of the coverage and the scope, wherever we need to go into detail, we will do as we actually jump into the E1 course. Okay, so let's move on. So as I said, organizations are a group of people, a team of people who come in with a purpose to achieve a common goal. Organizations typically have a mission. The mission basically represents the purpose why they are. It represents what brings them together. Organizations also have something called a vision. Vision is basically a future state, an intention of where they want to get into from where they are today. And of course, the goals and the objectives. We'll cover that in detail. So, like I said, it is all about collective goals, arrangements. So it doesn't have to be only for profit. We have societies, trusts, we have different forms of organizations. We have organizations in terms of partnership and companies, again formed with different purposes, but a structure which brings them together for a common purpose. Then we have other areas where, as I mentioned, healthcare, education, we have non-governmental organizations, we have NGOs, we have cooperatives, which is very common in India. As you see, as India lives in villages quite a bit, and villages are the best breeding grounds for cooperatives, where everybody contributes a certain very small of money, put together a capital, and then share the results or the profits or the benefits equally. So it is not one small group of people investing, working, and then basically sharing it with the shareholders as it happens in a private or a listed company. This happens, the cooperatives work primarily on a small group of people coming together and trying to put something together for a common purpose. This works very well when there are small investors and when there is localized business, whether it is farming, agriculture, estates, plantations, and so on. So moving on, we have mission. So mission basically is the purpose, and it also talks about how you go about achieving the purpose. So do you have a strategy? Does the strategy clearly define how are you going to meet the purpose? What are the policies around which the strategy can be executed? Because strategy is more about your intention to achieve in a certain way, or you can, in simple terms, because strategy is the most, I would say, loosely used word in today's corporate culture. You have a strategy for a very small task to achieving a big market share, or investing in a big country, or buying out a big brand. So strategy is a word that is used interchangeably everywhere. So in simple terms, strategy is a plan of action to achieve a certain objective, and it clearly defines how. It is the how of what we're trying to do. And mission is basically what or why. And of course, between this purpose and the strategy, which is surrounded by policies or guidelines, are the culture. So culture again is a very interesting term. Now, a lot of us, when we work for an organization, we talk about culture. We said we have a good culture, we don't have a great culture. Our culture does not allow employees to speak up. Our culture does not, allow, I would say, a dress code which is more modern. Our culture does not allow us to work from home or to work from a certain offsite location. So culture is how the organization's people or the employees perceive the climate to be, the environment to be. Now, culture is a larger term. I mean, environment is purely about your surroundings, or a particular department, or a particular office, or a particular floor, or something. But culture is more about how people perceive an organization's climate to be, and what does it stand for, what does it speak for. So if you work for a company and you move into another company, and the other person would definitely look at you and say, if you come from this company, you possibly have gone through a culture which is different. And many times you heard people saying, I moved into a company where I see a culture shock. They say that I am seeing something which is completely different than what I've seen. Now, the interesting thing is, can you actually know what a culture shock is? I mean, can you realize, can you understand? Is it possible for you to assess, fathom the culture of an organization before you get into? In the past, it was not possible, because I think we didn't have access to a lot of information other than actually talking to people working there. But today we have a lot of information in the public domain. We have, I would say, internet websites that are governed by HR professionals or community. There's an excellent website called Glassdoor.com. I'm not sure if you've heard or seen it. It typically talks about information that an employee can post about his organization. And of course, some of them are anonymous, but then it talks about what he or she goes through or experiences in an organization, and how does he feel about it? Does he like it, not like it? There is always a risk of these kind of websites where people end up voicing their concerns, because they would use it in the wrong sense. They would basically do some damage to the reputation of an organization. But I think end of the day, if somebody has a very extreme negative view about an organization, there must be a reason for it. Can you all hear me again? Okay, wonderful. So, like I said, culture is a very interesting term. A lot of organizations today, in the last, I would say, at least 10 years, especially the technology companies or companies in IT space, have actually completely changed the way employees are working. And that is why you see the generation today, at least people in the early 20s, prefer to work for those companies where they feel certain restrictions are not there, or certain policies that are restrictive are not in force. And of course, the values. So values will, of course, touch as we move forward. But if you look at values, we are talking about what does the company stand for? What are the principles? So as human beings, we all have certain principles in life, certain value systems in life. We believe in certain things. We associate ourselves with something that we say that I would never do this, or I would stand for it, or this is what defines me, or if I was in this position, I would do it, or if I was in this position, I would never do it. So similarly, organizations also have values that are mostly stated, not implied, stated expressively in their various documents, and they stand for it. There are organizations who say they stand for innovation. There are organizations who say they stand for employee welfare. There are organizations who say their focus is on customer centricity, and so on and so forth. So that is where I think the values come into play. It's important for every employee to imbibe on the values of the organization, because that is where he or she has a connect with the organization. If your personal value system is absolutely opposite of what the organization thinks or does, somewhere down the line, I think the employee will not enjoy his time in the organization. And that is where you see some people don't relate to that. They spend some time in the organization, they don't see that organization almost linking to their values, and then they decide to leave. Moving on to the objectives and the goals. So in very simple terms, objectives are targets or goals or something that you want to achieve over a period of time. I'm sure you are aware of the fact that objectives have a very fundamental principle of being smart. So where objectives need to go through certain specificity, time bound, or I would say achievable perspective. So if you heard about SMART, SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. The problem of not having these, and I'm sure you can Google this, you can find out, you can get better examples there in terms of how organizations use it. Typically, it is important because if we don't have these parameters or perspectives, it becomes extremely difficult to measure whether you achieve something over a period of time. It becomes extremely vague, it becomes continuous, it becomes perennial, and there are no metrics or measurements to basically find out you met or not. So it's important when we talk about objectives that it is measurable and it is smart, it is achievable. It can't be completely outside your influence. It has to be realistic. We should know that it is possible, but it has to be with a certain amount of effort. And it has to be time bound, because if it's not time bound, it becomes very difficult. And on vision, I think the vision of any company is about where they want to go. How would they want to perceive themselves down the line? It is nothing but a journey from a current state to a future state, where people would like to see, where they want to go at some period in time. The reason to have a vision is that when you have a vision, you have a strategy, and then when you have a strategy, then you have an objective or a goal. So first you need to know where to go. So if I take a very simple example of reaching a destination. Let's say if you are in Delhi and you want to go to Nagpur, for example, you have to have a vision of where you're going, or you need to know where you need to go. And from there, you need to basically know how to reach there. There are different modes today, there are different ways to go. And then you have to know how do you break those how strategies into goals and objectives in order to see whether you're actually going to the same place, going in the way you can go, and then of course see whether there is enough progress, whether you are late, whether you are early, whether you are doing the trip safe, and so on. So it's important to have vision, and a lot of organizations who do not have a very clear vision sometimes falter as they progress, and sometimes they redefine vision because that is important for them to ensure that somewhere they are not heading towards what they want to, and then they need basically a redefinition of that. So moving on to the next stage in terms of stakeholder. So now stakeholder is someone who is impacted, who is influenced, who also influences the organization. He's someone who has a very deep interest in what's happening. Either it could be an investor, or it could be a shareholder, he could be a government, he could be a society, he could be an employee, he could be an NGO or a charitable organization. He could be anybody. It could be anybody. The reason we are talking about stakeholders all the time is because today we are looking at this from a organization perspective, which is listed or which is in the public domain. And as you know, the way what is going on today in terms of different things in the country, right from your implementation of GST to your ban on plastics to areas where there is a lot of focus on carbon emission and so on. There are different people who are very interested or involved in seeing what an organization is trying to do. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and maybe 80s, while there was always a focus towards society and government, I think companies took it for granted that because they are serving society, they are generating employment, and they have the muscle power or the money power basically to uh, influence policies. This was not so much of a focus, but today it is not the case. And it's important for us to understand that today's organizations are extremely focused over what stakeholders are saying and doing. They are extremely interested, and they're very serious about it. And there are a lot of companies who are actually going all the way to involving different key stakeholders in every important decisions, whether it is relocating from a particular site to another site, whether it is starting a new business, or entering into a territory which is governed by certain regulations or law that does not allow factories or manufacturing units, and so on. There are enough examples for it. I think one of the best examples is Sterlite. If you look at what's happening in Sterlite today, with the different protests going on in terms of the environmental damage that the industry is supposedly causing, and a company like Vedanta, which is one of the top companies in the world into energy, power, and mining areas, have not been able to still reopen them after all the efforts that they've taken. Had this been 30 or 40 years back, I would say that they would have easily had their way. Today it is not possible. Today there are larger, I would say, lobby for going completely in line with the society and the environment than purely focusing on profiteering for a group of individuals. So moving on from organization, so any questions, any thoughts, anything that you want to know or ask, any examples that you specifically want? It's a very vast subject, so if I start getting into a lot of detail in each of these areas, I think probably we will need at least 3 hours. So I'm just trying and making sure I try to connect the different areas through the different concepts we are talking about, and maybe give you a couple of examples wherever I feel it is extremely important. Okay, can I move on? Hello? Okay, wonderful. Good. So moving on to the next slide. So here onwards, I will try and attempt to quickly go on, because I think what we will be now covering is an offshoot of what we've covered in the first slide. So I will try and spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes on each slide, basically to explain to you, but then I will stop only when you have a question, otherwise I'll move forward. So there are a lot of research on how organizations should be structured, and there are different components for it. One of these guys called Milzberg actually came up with the concept of building blocks, where he talked about various important blocks for an organization, where he talks about just a moment, different components of an organization, whether it is the outside world, the internal functioning, and the key, I would say, stakeholders who are impacted. Then we had different studies from which talks about the way organizations are set up. So whether it is functional, divisional, or based on geography. So either you are set up by a function called marketing, or you're set up by, I would say, geography, where you're particularly focusing on a region. So either if you take India, you probably have 4 geographical regions: north, west, east, and south. And then within that, you have, I would say, different functions or divisions. Or you are by product. So when I say function, I mean product or service. So if you take an example of Reliance is a huge conglomerate. So you may have one on power, one on energy, one on telecom, but within telecom you have one on internet, one on mobile phone, maybe one on, and within that you may have, again, there'll be sales, there'll be service, there'll be technical support wherever there's a problem with any of the phone or the internet connections and so on. So typically there is no one right way of being organized. It gets extremely specific to an organization in terms of what works, but typically every few years organizations go through these restructuring to see what works better. For an organization which is more service oriented, if I take an example of telecom, insurance, or any other service oriented industry, it has always been important to align themselves by function or by product or service, and then within that they have different functions, because what happens is the person who heads the function or service is in a better position to understand what is happening across the different departments and across geographies. Otherwise there is a risk of these. For example, if I take telecom again, there is a risk that if you are set up geographically, that each region may end up working in silo, may not really understand what is going on with the other regions in terms of the particular service type. So if I take geo as an example, so if I put all the geo servicing functions by geography, probably it's very difficult to share information and work together in terms of understanding the customer by region if you are spread across different regions. So that's why certain times, it is important to organize yourself by function. The organizations that I've worked for has always been based on function. There is always a need to have geographical or location specific, I would say, structure, but that's at much lower level. Usually organizations are more functional at the top level. Having said that, there are also different dynamics by region. So if you take the entire world, and if you take an example like HP, Hewlett Packard, one of the companies I work for, while they are also function based, they're also highly region based, and that's where it becomes matrix. So while they have a separate division for enterprise, which is basically your servers, your networks and so on, then they have a personal computing and laptops and PCs and desktops and so on, and then they have other functions. Within that, they're also highly geography based. So they have Asia, Americas, Europe, Middle East, Far East. So they have a region structure below the function structure, and below that they have something called a cluster. So even within Asia, I'm sure you will understand the fact that Asia is very dynamic, because Middle East Asia is very different than West Asia. West Asia or Southeast Asia is very different than Far East, and so on, in terms of people, culture, tastes, purchasing power, and so many other things. So it is not always useful to basically combine everything into a structure called Asia, because Asia itself is a world. If you look at a country right from Dubai or UAE in the extreme west to something like Japan in the extreme east, both in terms of time zone and the kind of people and the resources, the natural resources, the topography, the culture, the climate, so many different things. It's impossible to have a strategy for a whole of Asia as one. So there is a need to basically clusterize them or have sub-region segments. And the same happens in India as well. If you take north, I'm very sure the north, which is Rajasthan, is very different than the north, which is Bihar. And if you take a good example of south, I mean, best example I can give is a state of Andhra Pradesh is so different from a state of Kerala, if you look at it, because of the way the culture is, the way the people are. It's a communist government, the employment, the natural resources, the availability of talent, the availability of so many other things. So it's important to also understand that when segmentation happens for either going for a customer augmentation or for a service type, or to understand which products will work where better, I think different stages of structurization is required. And that's where it's important to have sometimes a matrix structure. So moving on quickly, there are companies which are also looking at, I would say, hollow structures, remote structures today. A lot of companies today have people working remote, they're working modular. So if I have, let's say, 10,000 employees around the world, I may have people working in customer service in only one region or probably in only one or two countries. So I would take a best example of modular as Philippines. So in my career, working for the companies that I'd worked for, especially in the BPO and the voice space, a lot of organizations have centralized their calling, inbound, outbound, customer service, sales, kind of activities which are voice based to Philippines, Manila, because traditionally Philippines is a country that has a rich talent of people speaking English. They have a very close connection to Spanish, Portuguese, and English speaking population in the world. A lot of the Philippines citizens' names, if you see, will resemble with people in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, if you look at the surnames. So the reason is that there is a benefit of having people centralized in a location, modularized in a location, where there is abundant manpower, there is abundant talent, there is abundant supply of resources, and also the relevant cost. So if you could do the same in probably Latin America, you would have to probably pay them more, or you may not get the scale that you need. Similarly, virtual organizations again, organizations which are completely virtual, people working around the world, reporting to a regional center or a global center. Literally, people who don't see each other face to face, they are governed by KRAs or objectives, they are governed by certain guidelines and policies. There is a lot of flexibility, there is a lot of empowerment. At the same time, there are clear targets and expectations from such people. Moving on quickly on the approaches that company have done today, looking at the span of control, looking at how the organizations need to be lean, need to be optimal, need to really understand how they need to be organized. Gone are the days when you had a very tall structure where right up to the person from the bottom to the head of the organization or the I would say the CEO, you had several layers. I'm just covering the next few points together because I need to bring that connection together. So those were quite a lot of layers, a lot of the I would say different positions, designations, bands, grades created because everybody thought during those days that there has to be differentiation between each layer. So if you talk about purely in terms of numbers, so number 1 to number 20 being the person who is the CEO of an organization, there was a clear understanding or a thought that each layer will do a different role. But if you really see, the difference between 1 and 2 could be very minimum, 3 or 4 could be very minimum. And this was more because there was always an aspirational value in certain cultures, like India, for example. So every 2 years, you have to be promoted to a new designation, even if you end up doing the same job or similar job. So today, organizations, especially in the Western world, is very flat. there are clearly 7 or 8 structures or 7 or 8 layers depending on the top-down approach, where, like I said, either we are based on function or geography or division. So either it's the head of the company, then we have the board, then we have functions, then we have geography, probably then we have divisions, and then the last 3 or 4 is purely people at junior management level. And doing that, actually what happens is a role 1, which typically used to be role 1, 2, 3, 4 in the past, or 1, 2, 3 in the past, has more wider exposure today, and they're able to operate between both the extremes that 3 different layers used to do in the past. And that is where it helped people, because today it is not about getting a promotion to a role, it is also about enriching the current role. So many times it happens in organization that you are not actually vertically being promoted, but you horizontally move and take a larger responsibility or add your scope or responsibility, and then basically grow within the same role. I mean, it's a different view each organization has on whether they give a name to it or not, but fundamentally it only means that as an organization you basically enrich yourself over a period of time in order to deliver. And with all this, what is happening in the environment around us is the need for moving a lot of centralized activity. Like I talked about modular or virtual, there are concepts where today a lot of companies are centralizing activities in a region close to them. So if I take, for example, a global company, let me take an example of IBM. If you take IBM, which is present in almost every known country that we are aware of in the world, I think they have now clearly have certain nearshore centers or centers which are regionalized. So for Americas, they may have a center where it is less costly, there is availability of talent, there is a good environment to do business, politically stable, economically viable, and so on. So maybe they will choose Mexico, maybe they'll choose Costa Rica, which is one of the also one of the countries that attracts a lot of talent, a lot of work. And similarly, they will look at Europe. Probably they'll look at East European countries which are less expensive. Again, they are like India and Brazil and South Africa, developing countries, the likes of Romania and Poland and so many other countries. And then similarly, today Africa is a little bit of untapped area. I think except South Africa, the rest of Africa is still considered a dark area. But then if you take Asia, again, either India or China and so on. So typically these are regional centers depending on the type of business you do, for example, IBM. Then within those regional centers, you also have global centers. Now, India and China are good examples of global centers. While in Asia, they may still have a regional center in, let's say, Singapore or Hong Kong, which are definitely more expensive than India or even China. But for a global center where they can perform activities that are more transactional, that are more rule-based, that demand a certain level of skill only, whether there is no customer interaction, whether decision making is not extremely complex, they would end up offshoring it or moving it to those companies, to those countries. Now, what happens in offshoring is that typically first you outsource it, meaning you move it from a decentralized setup to a centralized setup, which is mostly region. Like I said, 5, 6, 7, 8 regions in the world. And from there, they are able to offshore it. Offshoring typically means you are moving it to a global center, which is again a good example could be India, China, and maybe Philippines if it is voice process. Now, what happens typically is when you do this, there are different advantages that you get over a period of time. And organizations have seen that. Today, you know, the ITES industry in India is pretty big. There are several million people who are employed in them, and they do various kind of activities that maybe 15 years was unheard of. In a company that I used to work before, Maersk, the activity of operating cranes, which is supposed to be a very physical, I would say, location or closer to where the activity is happening, is done from a back office. It's from a back office. It is not done in any of those locations. Planning of shipping routes, planning of vessels. There are so many other things that we do that once considered completely, I would say, possible only if it is closer to the port, or if you have decades of experience on shipping, or you understand the way ports operate, different countries operate. Today it is done from centers where people are basically mastering the processes with procedures in place and learning it by doing it over a period of time. So these are some of the very interesting things that are happening. And when it comes to enterprise pillar from a CIMA or ACCA perspective, it is important to know that these are something that have been tested and proved over the last good 2 decades now. And companies are adopting what they feel is good for them because they need to see benefits coming out of these operations. Of course, there are challenges everywhere in terms of trying to do something different than what traditionally it has been done. But I think we also have to understand that some of these companies in the original setup also had those challenges anyways. So whether there was natural calamities or issues with labor, regulations, or maybe employment, people moving in, moving out, and so many other challenges that normally the industry that we are into, I'm talking about, is facing. It was always the case in the past as well. So it was not something very different that we are seeing today. Any questions so far before we move on?